to Stefan.
All right. Thank you, Fiona. Thank you, Phil, for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited. I'm looking forward to this.
Let's do this.
Yeah.
All right. So I will kick the webinar off, and I want to talk about modern architectures without maintaining servers. And Fiona said it already. I'm working in the developer relations team at Contentful, and now my clicker should work. And I love the web, right? And I'm also working for quite a while in the web, and I love building for the web. And when I started working in the web dev industry, there were different kind of developers. So there were backend developers and front-end developers. And as you see it there already, the front-end developers looked a little bit arty, right? So this was, I don't know, 7, 8 years ago. And front-end development was considered to be doing CSS and making everything pretty. And number one rule was everybody stays on their side, right? And then we all progressed a little bit, and new technologies appeared. So there, Webpack came along, and then now we have React, and then we have this buzzword hanging around, which is progressive web apps, and now we have Vue, and all the browsers are constantly shipping new cool features every month. And I don't think it's that artsy anymore. So now actually front-end development is also engineering, and it's also very heavy engineering. So when we want to build good products, we have to deal, or we have to hire, or we are two different kind of experts. So we've got the backend experts. These people deal with servers, right? How to set up Nginx and how to scale that thing. These people deal with databases, with Redis, maybe Postgres, MySQL. Then they figure out how to scale all these things. That's not an easy task to do. They figure out how to make it secure. Oh my God, I couldn't even imagine doing myself this. And they do so much, much more. And then we have the front-end developers. This is more where I'm coming from. So we know about how browsers work, how the DOM works, how CSS works. We make our websites fast, so how to structure a website so that it's loading fast. We know how to do responsive web design. It's not about websites anymore, right? It's about phones, fridges, cars, websites, whatever we have out there. Progressive web apps, we know how to do service workers, more or less, I would say. And there's still so much, much more. So what happens now when you're building your website in the modern architecture and you want to bring in a new feature? When you want to develop a new feature, both sides of these kind of developers are involved. And this will always, and this won't change, this will take a lot of money and time, because these group of people, these experts have to huddle, they have to spend a research sprint. You probably have one of these to then have a plan and maybe start eventually building something. And there's always the question that is hanging around in your company or when you're doing feature development, will we actually succeed? I do development now for 8 years, and I was failing for a few projects where I had to go back. I had to say to my manager, I'm sorry, I messed that up 3 sprints ago, and I want to start from scratch. That happens. And because developers are just humans. And the question that I want to ask in the next, 20 minutes is, does it actually have to be like that? So when we look in the front-end world, this started happening 3, 4, 5 years ago. When we're dealing with the browser landscape, we have some kind of widgets available, right? So you see a Twitter widget there, you see a Google Maps widget there, and you see maybe a commenting platform for free, just embed a little JavaScript snippet. And I hear you saying, yeah, but Stefan, these are all just UI widgets, right? This is not real development, is it? But I want to ask you, well, are they? Because actually what we're seeing here is a little bit of JavaScript that talks with a little bit of APIs under the hood. And let me ask you one question. Would you have the one idea to rebuild this Maps widget? I definitely don't want to do that. Would you start building or maintaining your own newsletter software, sending 50,000 emails per month? I'm not sure about that. Do you want to do real-time support software by yourself? Or, all right, you're in a Contentful webinar, right? Would you build and maintain your own CMS? And after doing development for long enough, I can tell you that writing good software is actually really, really hard. So what we now all understand is that when we want to ship products to several devices is that we have to base our products on JSON, right? This is something that I think a lot of people understood so far. And when I'm going out to conferences or when I'm talking to people, what I very often got is the question, all right, Stefan, so isn't Contentful just a JSON API on top of a database? And I want to say, no, it's way, way more. Because when you want to start to build a content management system, first of all, you need the content delivery API to ship the content you aggregate to all your different devices and clients. But then you have to make it scalable so that your data is available basically everywhere. So it's already a little bit more than just an API layer on top of a database. The content has to be delivered by fast CNs. But then you're already running into the next problem, which is basically one API is not enough, because when you have a lot of people that are entering a lot of content, they also want to see what happens when they hit publish, which then means that you already need a second API if you want to do content management possible, so that everybody is happy and feels safe. And then it's also about you as a developer to evolve and structure and aggregate new content, which means that you also need a third API to kind of change the content that you have when you need some certain changes to the content structures you put in. But then there's the question, okay, how do we actually evolve content in a JSON API? I did content management for a while and for a few years. So what you usually do is you have an SQL database, you've got an Apache server, and then you copy the whole thing and then to your local environment, and then you write an SQL script that you can then inject on the production environment. But how do you do that actually with an API? We thought about that problem too at Contentful, and we found out that a lot of people said, yeah, it's great, we can bring our products and release our products very, very quickly, but then we got problems when we have content production because we cannot change it easily anymore. So the solutions we came up with are sandbox environments, which are basically kind of the equivalent to the SQL database dump. So you can create a copy of the content that is Contentful by just clicking a button. And we allow you to migrate the content using a scripting language. If you want to learn more about that, my colleague Shai gave a nice talk about that. And these requirements are only touching the surface of content at scale. When you decide to maintain and build your own product, serving or solving one problem, it is always more complicated than it looks on first sight. And who doesn't know this situation? So your boss comes to you, hey, how long do you think will this take? And you know that you should not answer this question. And your brain says, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And the result is, shouldn't take long. I just told that to our CMO here at Contentful 2 days ago. We now have a bet that I will implement something in 10 minutes. Let's see how this goes. So the thing I just want to tell you, and for the example of content management, is that I wouldn't reinvent the wheel, because I have to maintain and scale that wheel later. And this is a big, big problem. And there today are a lot of specialized services out there. So we've got, for example, Twilio to send SMS and do real-time communication. I wouldn't even think of trying to figure out how to send a message. I wouldn't even know where to start. Payment is another thing. I wouldn't even know where to start, so I just use a service for that. I worked in companies before where we spent sprint over sprint over sprint to make a fast search, and we were still slower than Algolia. And then we have Contentful doing a content management infrastructure so that you can scale up across devices and platforms. And then we have platform as a service provider like Netlify, where Phil is working, or Heroku, one level below. And if we want to go down, we can go to AWS or Azure if this is our jam. But we don't have to reinvent everything and start from scratch. There's always a service for something. And the kind of app development landscape proves me right here. So when we look at app development today, we see, and look at global statistics, we see that 50% of all the apps out there use 2 to 5 APIs. I think this is a good measure to kind of say, yeah, I found out my problems, and I will use just a service for that to speed up my development and publish these to the App Store or to the web. And then we have 9% of apps out there that use more than 25 APIs, which I have to admit that is sporty, 25 APIs in your product. So where we're right now is that the software, the way we build software actually has changed, right? We're coming from this idea that we built this big server stack ourselves, and we're breaking it down into several tiny services, just connecting the pieces. And man, there's a lot of stuff out there. And recently there was Jamstack Conf, and Chris Koya just blew a lot of services in the audience that you most likely can use for free to a generous terms. And there's so much good stuff. So the question is always then, sometimes people tell me, Stefan, I don't want to pay $10 or $100 to pay for a certain service. But just because you're not paying a subscription doesn't mean it's actually free. A person that has to build, maintain, solve bugs for stuff you build yourself costs money. And when you build your own solution, you have the problem that the community is not helping you. When you build your own, it's your own, and you have to deal with this. Maybe this will be more expensive than $100 for a subscription. Maybe. So what I want to tell you is just evaluate carefully and consider time and effort of your developers, because this is where the details are hidden. Just because there's a price tag on it doesn't mean that it is expensive. But then there's the question, okay, I'm Stefan, I'm all in, and I will now use all these services that are out there. But how do you connect then all these dots? And that is actually a tricky one. And it was for me very, very tricky 2 years ago still. But be ready, buzzword approaching. Now we have serverless computing, and everything changed. And serverless is one of these terms that I'm like, first of all, I cannot hear it anymore, but I'm also not really sure what it means. Serverless computing basically means that developers no longer have to think that much about servers. Computing resources get used as services without having to manage around physical capacities or limits. I understand that, but when you go out and you read about serverless, there are still 3 different things people talk about. So we have serverless computing. This could mean all the cloud services out there, just an umbrella term for everything, which includes Contentful, Netlify, Twilio, Firebase, whatever you can think of. It could also mean function as a service. So you see there AWS Lambda, Google Cloud, or Microsoft Azure. Or just because developers like to troll each other, it could also mean the serverless framework, which is a framework to deploy and manage function as a service of serverless functions. So at the end, when you hear the buzzword serverless, yeah, you have to kind of figure it out what the person is talking about. Chris Koya, who gave this awesome talk, also put together a really nice resource. It's called The Power of Serverless for Front-End Developers. I think this has a lot of value for every developer out there. And basically, Chris also defined serverless a little bit different, and he's coming from the front-end development angle, and this is maybe what I like the most about this. And he said that serverless, you can take your front-end skills and do things that typically only a back-end can do. This sounds to me like magic. But then there was also another person from Oslo, and he basically said, serverless means that I'm a JavaScript dev and everything is Legos. I love that. But this is actually not true, because serverless is not bound to JavaScript at all. So what I want to talk about the next 2 minutes or 5 minutes is, okay, why are these why is this Lego approach so nice? And what role does actually function as a service play? So let's have a look at function as a service, AKA cloud functions. So the idea is pretty cool, and it's not too hard to understand. So you have a cloud function, which is literally just a little bit of source code, let's say 50 lines of code, that you can upload to your function provider. Then you have no servers to maintain. You just push it, and it will run whenever you define it should run. It will automatically scale. So when you're building an HTTP endpoint, and this got hit by a lot of traffic, AWS maybe, or another provider, will automatically scale that up, so you don't have to worry, and you don't have to get the SMS via PagerDuty that something is on fire. And you're not paying for a serverless function when they're not running. So when you think of this, this sounds like magic to me. And I'm using serverless functions now for roughly a year, and I'm just heavily in love with serverless function. So when you want to figure out how much a serverless function costs, there's this nice little tool, and you will find out that usually, well, it won't cost anything, because all the providers have generous free plans. But you can have a look there in case you think you will execute and you will get into the limits of certain providers. So how does a serverless function look like? So this is a JavaScript example. So you could export a function that just returns a string that says hello from Lambda, but this could also be C#, Go, Python, or Java. Cool. But let's roll with the JavaScript version here. So, and I'm playing with Lambda. So I would push this to AWS Lambda, and now I would have to configure API Gateway. I think this is a horrible sounding name because it sounds very complicated, but actually it's just a mapping of HTTP verbs and paths to a certain function. And then I'm deciding that I want to return some JSON instead of a string so that we have a real API. And congratulations, we just created our first HTTP endpoint. I think this is super, super nice. And since I discovered that I can do this, I'm playing around almost every weekend with serverless functions. So let me introduce you to my serverless weekend. This was, I don't know, 5 weeks ago. So I had a serverless weekend. So I defined this function. This accepts the path parameters. So I'm defining, if in case an exception happens, okay, I should be a good web citizen. So I'm throwing a 500. Then I'm getting the short URL parameter, which is defined in the path definition. And then asking the Contentful API, hey, do we have another value stored for this short URL? And then I'm just doing some stuff. I'm parsing a few things. And you don't have to get the whole thing. But at the end, I just built myself a URL shortener with 40 lines of JavaScript. And when you go there now, my links online 99 problems, you will go to the webinar page. It only works with a subdomain right now, though, because I haven't made it to figure out AWS yet. But I will work on that. And yes, I bought this domain. So you can run serverless function on Google, on AWS, Microsoft, and IBM. But there are also smaller players out there. Because when I logged in for the first time into the AWS console, oh, wow. So it can feel a little bit intimidating. So there are also tools like WebTask, which is by the Auth0 folks. You can just literally log in, define a little bit of JavaScript, and you have then a public API endpoint available. Or then you have services like Netlify that allow you to use functions right inside of your static site provider, or in Netlify, which is a pretty cool thing. Because I think in the future, cloud functions will become a requirement to keep the complexity low. What I discovered before is then when you have a lot of API providers, you place a lot of functions everywhere, which then is the case, hey, Stefan, where did you deploy this function? I'm like, it's somewhere in AWS, but AWS has different regions, different users, and finding out where I deployed something is a tricky thing to do. So when a function or when a software as a service provider gives me the possibility to deploy functions, I'm the happiest person in the world because I can place the functions where my use case is. So when should you use the Lambda function? When you have low complexity. This person defining a URL shortener, that's very low complexity. When it's self-contained, when you don't have a lot of complexities to the outside, and when it's short-lived, right? Lambda function or cloud functions are paid, the price is depending on the time they run, right? So it shouldn't run for ages. And these functions are perfect to connect different services. You literally become a conductor. You will become a serverless conductor because you already have a lot of tools in your toolbox. So at Contentful, for example, we use Discourse and we use Slack. And Discourse has an official Slack integration. Unfortunately, Contentful, we have 2 Slack organizations because we have a public and a private one. And I wanted to pump all the messages from the public forum to our community Slack. So how would I do that? Well, I write myself a quick function and push it back to Slack. In case you haven't done it yet, pushing stuff to Slack is very easy. You just say, hey, I want to push something to a channel, and here's the URL. And then you have to send some JSON, and the message will appear magically somewhere. And with this, I already have this function in place that could distribute that data wherever I want. So how could that look like? Here we have the quick function. You parse the event data that is coming in. Then I'm figuring out the data. Okay, who posted something? What's the title of the thread? What are we dealing with? And then I'm just making another request to Slack. And this is all it takes. And I think this is very, very beautiful. And the result is this. A tiny little Slack bot that tells me and all the other users in our community, when someone had a question. But I also went a little bit further then. So what you see here is that I also built a little onboarding function. So when you go to the community and type onboarding, you get this message, which is great. You also see this message when you sign up for the first time. And to avoid that I have to redeploy this function all the time, I set myself up a little Contentful entry, which just includes some JSON, so that I can change the content that the people will see when they sign up for the first time without redeploying this function. And as you see, I'm just connecting dots. So we have a cloud function, we have Contentful, and we're pushing everything to Slack. And just recently, assets are also a thing very often, and people talk to me, okay, can we do asset manipulations, very particular ones? So let's say someone is uploading an image to Contentful. Contentful supports something that is called webhooks, which basically are HTTP calls to a service of your choice. So you can then define, okay, when someone uploads an asset, please push it to a Lambda function and tell the Lambda function, hey, something happened. Then you can download the image in a Lambda function, and you can watermark it, or you can do whatever fancy operations you want to do with this. I wrote about that, and the code that you need to kind of connect all these dots is relatively small, and this scales automatically. Another cool thing that I discovered is that functions actually are schedulable. So last weekend, I had serverless weekend again, so I built myself a Twitter bot that randomly tweets MDN pages. That you can schedule these like a cron job, man, super cool. So connecting services has never been easier. Instead of building and defining and maintaining new functionality yourself, you should spend your time building a business and not reinventing the wheel. So what API-driven architectures could you follow? So let's have a look at this. It doesn't really matter if you're on the server side or the client side, because the world speaks, or APIs speak HTTP. So if you want to get some content into Contentful from the server side, go for it. If you want to get some e-commerce stuff from, for example, Commerce Layer into your server side, go for it. Maybe you want to display some content from Contentful in the client, yep. And connect your e-commerce platform with Contentful, or make it searchable, or log in and authorize users with Auth0. Just use the right tool for the job and connect all the pieces. And when you discover this, you will find yourself rethinking maybe architectures from the past. So let me show you a project that I set up 6 years ago. This is Perf Tooling today. This was my first Node project that I deployed to the cloud, and I was really proud of that. So this is Node, and I pushed it to Heroku. And what it is a resource collection of performance-related articles, videos, and slides, and all these kind of things. And at some point, I figured that maybe it would be cool to show some social statistics like Twitter, YouTube, GitHub, stars and likes, and all these kind of things. So I have this Node process running that fetches every 6 hours new stats, because this is how a Node process works. It runs and runs and runs. But this collection grew over time, so I had to push in more data into the Node process, which means that this process consumed more memory, and Heroku at some point just wrote me an email, dude, you have to upgrade your server because it's getting a little bit resource intensive here. Then I had to connect everything with Fastly because, well, I want to be the assets to be fast loaded, but I still only have the single application server. So this architecture is now 5 years old, and the Node.js process needs more and more memory. It will just grow over time. And I'm really not sure if this server will handle really high load, because I haven't tried it yet. But at the end, I'm paying every month to keep this server running. And this is where I will hand over to Phil, because the question is now, is it time for the jam for my little project from 5 years ago?
All right. Well, I personally think it's definitely time for the jam, but that doesn't mean a lot to anyone just at the moment. So I'm gonna start my slide deck now, and I'll see if I can help by defining exactly what Stefan's talking about when he says, "Is it time for the jam?" Because there is this this term that I've been talking about for quite a while, and it's starting to get a bit of traction. And Stefan already referred to the Jamstack, and I think that's an area that we can help here. But I want to just kind of clarify what it is we're talking about before we do anything else. So I'm going to try and spend 10, 15 minutes talking a little bit about the Jamstack, and talking a little bit about what that means, and then also give you a couple of examples of how that manifests. So for people who maybe haven't encountered the term Jamstack before,
haven't your screen yet?
Oh.
Did you press share?
I'm sorry. You were just looking at my face. That's unfortunate.
Yeah, we were just.
Thank you for telling me that. That would have been a long.
Would have been a little bit awkward.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
Yes.
Yes.
Have fun, Phil.
Thank you. That's so much better. Okay, where's to move this? Cool. Okay, so yeah, I have to also thank Stefan for these very literal images of jam. That's always a pleasant thing to see. So let me just talk a little bit about what Jamstack is before we do anything else. So the jam in Jamstack stands for JavaScript, APIs, and markup. And it's describing a particular way of building sites, a particular kind of an architecture. And some people may say, oh, okay, well, is this just a new word for static sites? Because when we dig into it, that'll become clear why people are saying that. And that's fair in many ways, but it doesn't really do it justice. It doesn't go quite far enough. So this kind of architecture is not necessarily new, but it's getting much more powerful all the time. So it's been called a bunch of things before. So yeah, we're talking about Jamstack now. Static is static sites. You often hear people talk about static sites. I like to talk about pre-rendered sites. That's another way you might hear about it. But there are other words as well. I've heard people talk about CDN ready sites, or short stack is a term that I used to talk about for a long time because it's taking pieces out of the stack and trying to reduce complexity. I've even heard the term web serverless, just to double down on Stefan's use of the buzzword serverless. It doesn't really matter, what we talk about it, because static HTML, is a thing. Stefan's mentioned that before. But this word static is a bit loaded. What does that mean? People often think about static sites and the word static as being undesirable or not very exciting. And even if we look at the definition of static, lacking movement or action or change, especially in an undesirable or an interesting way, that doesn't sound like a model that we want to use for building websites. So that word static is a little bit kind of misused at times. But when we say things like static sites, are we talking about an architecture, or are we talking about the experience that you yield as a result of that? And I think with this model, you actually don't have to create a static experience, but we actually get to use some static pieces in the delivery of the site itself. So that means that you can actually start to treat static as a real virtue. And I want to try and unpack what that means in a second. Stefan's already talked about kind of moving away from monoliths and using specialist services and standing on the shoulders of giants, if you like, and embracing APIs. And I want to kind of dig into why Jamstack fits into that, because in everything that Stefan's talked about, you could use that in all kinds of architectures. That lives with all kinds of architectures that you currently use. But I think it's particularly well suited to the Jamstack, so I need to qualify that a little bit. And I also want to talk about some tools and automation that empower that. So, to do that, let's look at this stack, and then maybe this will make it clear why I used to talk about the short stack in these kind of terms as well. Let's compare like a typical static versus dynamic kind of architecture, somewhat simplified, but just for the sake of an illustration. So, we're serving a site to a user on a dynamic architecture. We've got a user with their web browser who makes a request for a view of a page, and maybe that's hitting a CDN, or maybe it's not. But ultimately, that's going to be getting some content from probably a load balancer, which is going to have some logic in it, which will say, okay, well, I've got a bunch of web servers to manage this load, so I'll figure out which one is going to service this request. Those servers might go and talk to a database service to get the content, return the content, apply it to a template to create a view, pass it through the load balancer to find the right person, possibly cache some things at a CDN, kind of stash some views there, and then ultimately return things into the browser, into the eyeballs of the user. That's a lot of failure points and a lot of places where things can happen and you have to manage all of that. Whereas on a static architecture, what we've got is the same scenario where users making a request for a view of a page. That content is already on the CDN, we return it and we're done. So right away, when we're looking at, this is why I talked about the short stack or shortening of the stack, this idea of removing the origin, removing web servers, removing things for you to manage, I think is a really liberating thing. And there's other benefits as well. And we'll dig into that in just a second. So, I think that static actually means it's capable of being served directly from a CDN, and that's a real virtue. It means that there's no work to be done at request time in this model for you to maintain and for you to operate in your own infrastructure that you manage. And that's got a bunch of benefits to do with like cost, performance, like managing risk, even development and time to market. There's huge opportunities there. So when we talk about the Jamstack and the JavaScript APIs and markup that drive that, key there is the APIs, and Stefan's talked about it already, because this Jamstack ecosystem, this environment of these different vendors and services that can enrich your site, really mean that we can go far beyond static and create lots of experiences that you might not typically have thought of in this way. And it's these APIs and this kind of this world of services that's kind of blossoming now that really takes that to the next level. So I want to just kind of focus on this part, the serving things from a CDN, and how do we get things there? Because that's where I come in. That's where the company that I work for kind of specializes. Because when we're thinking about deploying sites and getting things out into the wild, we want to focus on the build, and the builds can consume lots of APIs right there. So in your local environment, as you're building something out, you could be pulling in content from Contentful, you could be pulling in content from Algolia. All of these different services are available to you in the build. It means that you can build something and then propagate that to a CDN, get that into the eyeballs of the users as fast as possible. And in this way, it means that you can concentrate on your build and what you create, rather than managing CDNs, rather than managing caching layers and infrastructure and all of those things. So that's what I'm particularly excited about. So a key part of that, of course, is build automation. Making this repeatable, reliable, something that you can do many, many times is key. So many of us in our local environments have the possibility of kind of running tests, doing that content gathering, pulling things from the APIs, generating a site, perhaps performing some optimization, and then doing the deployment. And those are the kind of things that we might have running in our local environment. And that might look a little bit like this. We've got our local environment, the build runs, the cogs turn, we pull in content from APIs, and then we generate an asset that we can view locally in our static, our web server right there on our machine. That's great. And then we can push that to some kind of host environment, possibly a CDN, somewhere that creates some kind of hosting environment. There are lots of opportunities for that. There are no moving parts here. We're serving files from some resource. So that could be nice and fast. But really, when we want to mature this, we want to think about how we work with other people, what the collaboration opportunities are, what are the slightly richer workflows to make that go to the next level. And so that's where, here's the shameless plug, that's what Netlify is kind of focused on. We want to make it as fast as possible to create these experiences and then get them out into the wild. So that kind of similar scenario where we're running our local build and that's outputting something to a static server, rather than pushing the output of that to a CDN, what we tend to do at Netlify is that we'll run two things. We'll run the CDN, but we'll also run your build. So by leveraging Git and using Git workflows, we'll watch your Git repository instead. Then we'll run your build right there in our CI infrastructure and then push it to the CDN. So that means that you can stand on these kind of well-worn processes of pushing things into Git and managing things in Git and end up with a site that's deployed really, really rapidly. It's nice and kind of maintainable in that way. So this idea is all about lowering friction to make it faster to deploy things with confidence and know the results that you can then enrich later on as well. So I'm going to jump very quickly. I'm conscious that time is whizzing past me. I'm going to jump very quickly just to show you this kind of idea of this lower friction and what some of the benefits are by hopefully, are you still all seeing my screen? I'm just going to look at Stefan for some nodding. Thank you, Stefan. So this is my Netlify admin. I'm just going to go and choose one of my sites, my own site, to look at what this looks like here. And the thing that I particularly want to call out is just the deploys. Since we're working in this way of we're pre-rendering sites that we can push to a CDN, it now means that every site that every deploy that I've done is addressable. Each one of these items is a deploy that's happened in the past. And I've even got the information of what triggered that deploy. So was it a code push, or in this case, it was Twitter activity? Because I have a webhook, just as Stefan was describing, webhooks glue these services together. So I have a webhook that I fire whenever if this then that sees that I've tweeted. And when it does that, it fires the webhook, my build runs, it pulls in content from all of the different sources, including Twitter, and publishes it. So, if I just go in quickly and look at the deploy logs, this is exactly the same log that runs in my local environment when I build something out. So I can see all of that and see what's happened there. If I look at the site, actually, I'm going to use a different URL. I'll click on a different link. If I oh no, that is what I'll do. So if I look at the site, I have a URL for that. It's deployed on the CDN right away. But the nice thing is, at any point, I can step back through these deployments. I could go to, tell you what, I'm going to go bananas. I'm going to go right back to, what's this? This was August 2016. I can preview that deploy because it still lives there on this unique URL. So I have this low friction way of stepping forward and back through time. Because these are immutable builds that have been built out onto the CDN. If I wanted, I could publish this deploy. I'm going to do it. What the heck? I'll publish this deploy from 2006. So now if anyone was to go to, I should probably prove this out. If anyone wants to go to hawksworks.com, now I'm serving something from 2016, which happens to be a blog post which pulled in content from Contentful, but that's by the by, that's for another day. If you don't mind, I'm going to reinstate my site to the latest site. Oops. Uh-oh. Am I back? Oh, I'm back. Okay. Phew. Okay. I should probably not spend too long on that. But this notion of being able to have low friction deploys that you can step forward and back through time and do all kinds of really agile things on your deployment is a really liberating thing, and kind of takes you far away from this notion of static. I would at some point, maybe in the Q&A, I'm also going to talk about functions, because Stefan mentioned functions, and I want to talk about how much simpler it can be to build out functions and serverless functions as well through this process. But I'll leave that for the Q&A. For the moment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to jump back into my slides. Because I want to kind of stick to time a little bit. I'm just going to mention that this process is all about, this is all possible because we're building on modern development practices. When people are used to using Git and used to using Git workflows, we can build things on top of that. And then that allows you to not reinvent the wheel, reinvent these processes to get things live. It's enabled by this ability to serve static assets, which I think is core to the Jamstack, being able to get things to a CDN that you can then potentially enrich things like serverless functions later on. It's enriched by all of these APIs and services that exist, like pulling things in from the Twitter API or from Algolia or from Contentful. I pull all my speaking calendar in from a service called Notice, which is where I share all my slide decks. This is all happening. This ecosystem is getting richer and richer and richer, and we can pull these things in through these APIs. And so, just kind of to summarize a tiny bit, the Jamstack, I think, brings increased performance because we're serving things directly from a CDN. We don't have to hit logic that's running on servers that we then maintain. As a result, there's a far smaller security kind of attack surface. Our attack surface is far reduced because there are fewer moving parts. In fact, there are no moving parts here. We're serving files from a CDN. The moving parts live in APIs that other people are responsible for, and they specialize in that. So that's a really, really powerful model. As a result, also, we can scale much more easily than we might have done before when we're managing our own infrastructure. And that's just another advantage. And we've got this great agility from being able to deploy very, very rapidly because it's all built on a workflow that we've used and become accustomed to. So, sites like React are living on this model and hosted in this way. Vue, a lot of the big frameworks that are kind of hosted on Netlify as static sites, built out in this way. Even Yarn is on there. Squoosh, you might have seen that if you watched the Chrome Dev Summit talks. a couple of weeks ago. More app-like experiences like this, where you can do image optimization in the browser. These are built out as static sites. This one kind of hosted on Netlify as well. And so they're all kind of that you can have and deliver in this way. But as Stefan says, you can enrich this further with functions as a service, because this is your ready-made infrastructure to go that you don't have to think of as infrastructure. You're writing code knowing that it will run in an optimized way in infrastructure that you don't need to touch. So you can add just that extra level of interactivity and kind of features with things like functions as a service. So that's what happened on Smashing Magazine. There's e-commerce, personalization, job boards, all kinds of things that you might need a server for, running as a static site out on Netlify, a Jamstack site, I should say, enriched with functions as a service in the same way that Stefan talks about. So this is a specialized service. As Stefan mentioned, there are lots of services that specialize in particular areas. This specializes in creating a modern web development workflow for you and getting your content out to the edge. I think that's critical because it means that you can now focus on developing your product, developing your experience, and then differentiating, knowing some of this heavy lifting is done by other people who specialize in other things that you're now liberated from. So that's my 2 cents. That's what I think is kind of exciting. I'll open things up to questions, and I guess I'll happily hand back to Stefan to wrap things up.
All right.
Got a mouse point.
Yeah. That was lovely, Phil. Thank you very much. I didn't know that the Notice API is available already.
Yeah, it's a JSON API because the world speaks JSON, as you say.
I checked it 2 months ago and there was no API yet. I should have another look. It's racial neighbors, isn't it?
That's right. And I think pretty much any page, if you just put .json on the end of it, you'll find you get
no way.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. It's really nice. Okay, so should I stop sharing and we'll go back to seeing faces and going to questions? What's the best thing to do here?
We can do faces.
We can do faces. We've gone rather quickly through some of that, so I hope that made sense. Should we dive into the Q&A, Stefan? Is that what
yeah, let's do that. How do you synchronize? Oh, now it's starting. Okay. How do you synchronize contentful content model changes and merging new features into master? Okay, I'm answering that last. This kind of goes into the question how you evolve when your content model inside of Contentful changes. This pairs hand in hand with the environments feature that we have, and content model changes should always be scripted. So whenever you see yourself in Contentful changing it by hand, you should write a script afterwards and then apply this script later to master. Inside of the slides, there was this reference to a talk that my colleague gave, and he describes that in detail, how you can do that and bring in content model changes into master back again. Cool. So, how do you deal with databases in the Jamstack?
Okay, that's
Mr. Jamstack.
That's a fair question, and it's interesting because quite often I'm finding this isn't immediately an answer to this question, but quite often I'm finding that there are lots of sites that you can actually build without needing a database. So that's worth keeping in mind as well. But we're starting to see lots of nice patterns of doing data persistence and retrieval through serverless functions. That's a completely legitimate way of doing this. So at Netlify, we've actually been working on integrations with a company called FaunaDB, who have a particularly suitable database product for use with serverless functions. But frankly, you can integrate with many types of database through using serverless functions. So that's a good way of doing it. However, I'd also say that there is a surprising number of experiences that you might typically lean on a database for that actually you just need structured data for. It's a question of like really looking at whether you need that in the stack or not, because if you can avoid it, fabulous. You can. There's benefits to that as well. There's also a question about what sites is Jamstack good for. Now, I showed very quickly a few examples of some fairly kind of high volume traffic sites, things like React sits on on Jamstack and a few of the other kind of open source frameworks. But really, we're seeing the boundaries being pushed back further and further all the time. More interactivity, more targeted content is possible. The limits to Jamstack start to come in when you're doing very detailed personalization, when you really need to have things that are very personalized and curated content per user. Now you can go down that road with serverless functions somewhat to generate the views custom for people and be a little bit more dynamic there, but you do eventually start to run into some limitations. But those limitations are way further down the road than you might have thought. So you're starting to see e-commerce sites and all kinds of, the kind of thing that you'd expect to have lots of infrastructure yourself. E-commerce sites work perfectly. There are lots of libraries and integrations for helping with that. So really, the sky is kind of the limit.
Yeah. All right. So next one would be, how fast are serverless functions to cold boot? Are they suitable for user experience?
I'm sorry, I missed that question. Where was that question? Oh, I see. Yeah, there we go.
So my experience is, so I read about cold boot and the delay for the initial function call quite a while. It never hit me too bad, so that I was like, because when the function is warm, it's warm for a while. So this is my experience. I'm not the biggest expert here, but what about you, Phil?
Yeah, so I'm kind of the same. A lot depends on what you're using them for, which is why I still tend to lean on our old friend progressive enhancement. I think serverless functions are great for adding additional functionality once you've rendered a view. That's why I'm kind of cautious a little bit about using them entirely for returning dynamic views in their entirety. I prefer to use them to enrich through things like APIs. That said, Stefan just mentioned, once they're being used and they're warm, then you can get really fast results from them. So so it's definitely something to consider and something to test. But thankfully, it's simple to test these things. It's really easy to prove these things out because the barrier to entry is so low, and the things that you need to actually create and pay for to test these things out is super low. So you can actually start experimenting with that and actually see the real results for yourself and start to test some of those architectures. Yeah.
I think it's kind of the point that you have to figure out what you're using them for is very true. So when you're connecting services or building things with, for example, let's just take Algolia or Contentful as an example.
Yeah.
These kind of services are there to be used directly in front of the user, right? So we are specializing on speed. When you're kind of doing different things, maybe a 500 millisecond response time or even 300 milliseconds is all right for your use case. So kind of, I would say it depends on the situation there.
I think it completely depends on the situation, without a doubt.
Yeah, but personally, I'm pretty happy with that. I'm functions everywhere until I hit a wall.
Cool.
All right, then we have, can you show a Contentful Netlify integration? I'm not really sure about that one.
I can just, so what exactly does that question refer to? Are we talking about using Netlify and Contentful together?
I guess so.
So yes, okay, great. Well, I mean, in the time that we've got, I'm probably not going to dig into some code, but I can certainly describe that model quite nicely, because they live together really well. Contentful, pulling content from Contentful from the Contentful APIs, it is kind of as simple as it sounds. You're making requests to APIs and you're getting structured data, and that sits really nicely with any static site generator. And that's the bread and butter for Netlify. So I've got some posts on my blog actually, which I rolled back to 2016. That post right there.
Nice that was demo, by the way.
Yeah, that's it's nice when that happens with confidence. It's nice to see it switch back to present day. But yeah, the blog post on there does talk about pulling content into a static site generator build effectively with a gulp task. So I'm using gulp to pull that content, and then once I've got it locally, it's structured data, and then that's perfect fodder for any static site generator to run and generate its content. The other nice thing that I kind of mentioned very quickly when I was showing through the list of deploys was that you can trigger a Netlify build with a webhook, and Contentful emits webhooks. So it's a perfect kind of example of that integration where as soon as somebody saves the content, I think you can have different events in Contentful which trigger the webhook, whether it's saving or publishing, or there's a bunch of different options. But ultimately, it fires a webhook which tells Netlify to please run the build. It pulls the content from the API. You have it there ready to apply to your static site generator. So that's the model. I'm sorry that I'm not showing you some code, but I'm just thinking in the interest of time, that's probably not the best. But that's a good model. And someone's just mentioning as well, Gatsby works as a static site generator, and it has a plugin already there just for Contentful to say, point me at this URL, and I'll get structured data ready to use in my views. So it's a well-established path, I think, by now, which works really nicely.
Yeah, so I don't think that there's an official Contentful Netlify integration or something like that.
Right.
It just depends on your tech stack. Whatever can consume JSON in any kind of form, just push it in your build process and deploy to Netlify.
Right.
So my private website also runs on Netlify, and I'm going static with a little bit of JavaScript magic in the front end. So it's Vue. So I didn't jump on the React train.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. But whatever can consume JSON works fine with both of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I thought I saw there was another question I thought I saw.
What's the best way to handle deep links to pages on the site and redirects with the Jamstack architecture?
Okay.
Well, I think that is your one, huh?
that's for me. So I'll split this into a couple of pieces. So handling deep links into pages. So I might need some clarification on exactly what you're asking for that. But let me talk about the redirects for a second, because something that Netlify provides is a really logical way of declaring and configuring redirects. And these redirects all happen, again, you don't have a server, it all happens at the edge on the edge nodes. So you can create mappings for any URL matching across your site and set up things like redirects and declare what HTTP response codes you want, whether that's a 301 or a 302. It has some pattern matching and kind of splats and wildcards and those kind of things. And it goes a little bit further than that, because it also allows you to since you can specify any HTTP response code in that, you can also say you can proxy invisibly to APIs. So whether that's an API that is elsewhere in your infrastructure, or it's an API which is a serverless function, or if it's an API that's provided by a third party, you can invisibly proxy these behind the scenes just by setting up some of these routes in this redirect configuration file. And it really is as simple as, it's where from, where to, response code. And it's a file that lives as part of your code. So that's how we handle redirects. And it's important to note that is all happening at the CDN. So it's super fast. It's really performant. It's interesting to see Stefan talk about a URL shortening project, because I used the dynamically creating the redirect logic to do that, to kind of demonstrate that myself. So I think every one of us needs to build a URL shortener at some point in our lives. It's a rite of passage.
It's a big criteria for your career.
Right, exactly. Yeah, it's like talking about recursion in
I talked about recursion yesterday, actually.
Yeah. So I also want to, with deep links, I'm referring to SPA applications, SPA serving an index page with its own route. Great. Okay. So that's a really good question, and it's a common a common scenario where effectively you're serving everything from the same page, and then doing everything in the client, but JavaScript handling the URL manipulation. There is a setting, again, in the same redirects configuration in Netlify that wildcards that for you. So ultimately everything gets passed to the same place. I can dig that out and share that in the links here, but it's a one-line configuration in your redirects file for that scenario. So I'll share that in just a moment.
So it's always just serving the index file, right? Whatever comes in.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Cool. I think we're good.
Yeah. Did we get there?
Yeah. So then last thing is to say thank you, Phil, for
thank you.
1 hour of your time while it's very early in your morning.
Yeah, so I'm here I live in London, but I'm here in Vegas for the AWS reInvent event. So yeah, it's not too early now. It's 10 o'clock. It's fine. It's daytime. I've got nothing to grumble about.
All right, but we will finish the day now. So thanks everybody for listening and attending. You will get a follow-up email later with the recording and with some links that we just shared and mentioned. This was Phil Hawksworth. I'm Stefan from Contentful, and I think I'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot. See you soon.